In this video, I'm going to talk a lot about food and health and eating and body composition. If discussing these things is upsetting to you, then you might want to skip this video. Also, I am not a dietitian or a doctor or a scientist or any kind of health authority. This video is not meant to be advice on what to eat. If you want advice on that, go to your doctor, talk to them. Okay, with that out of the way, let's get started. Thanksgiving is just around the corner, and for my non-American audience, Thanksgiving is a holiday that falls on the fourth Thursday in November, and it's when we celebrate the Pilgrims escaping tyranny in England, coming to the New World, breaking bread with the Native Americans who lived here, and everyone lived happily ever after, amen. While the original meaning and history of Thanksgiving is a little rough, the holiday is still the entire centerpiece of the whole month. We spend the whole month thinking about food, planning what we're gonna make, deciding how big of a turkey to get. We have an entire holiday focused on eating. Now, in the midst of an obesity crisis, eating, or more specifically what we eat, is complicated. The food that we eat has a direct impact on our health. It can make us more susceptible to disease, it can boost our immune system, it can make us gain weight or make us lose weight. With that in mind, most of us try to eat healthy foods to varying levels of success. What we consider to be healthy is itself a challenging question. It seems like we're constantly bombarded by a barrage of conflicting information about which foods we should and should not eat. Remember when fat was evil? Fast forward to today, where the keto diet, a diet centered around eating healthy fats, is all the rage. How are we supposed to know what the truth is when it comes to healthy eating? Well, what if I told you that there is one single reason for all this confusion, and that one reason is a shadowy cabal of wealthy elites who pay off the government so that food companies can make unsubstantiated claims about the health of their products, all in the name of profit. You would probably say that that's far-fetched and a little crazy and conspiratorial, which it is, yeah, a little bit, but this is one conspiracy theory that actually happens to be true. Before we can get into the nefarious details of this conspiracy theory, we first need to understand how we got here. So, almost 100 years ago, the US was facing food shortages and mass hunger. The Great Depression caused economic turmoil that meant people couldn't always afford food. And when they could afford food, they often couldn't afford good, healthy, nutrient-dense food. People were hungry, they had nutrient deficiencies, they needed to eat more. So, the government enlisted the help of farmers and scientists to figure out what people needed to eat to be healthy and how to get those foods to the most people. It was a win-win situation, really. Well, a win-win-win. The food industry got subsidies and was able to make and sell more food and make more money. The people got to eat, and the government got to keep its people alive. This deal was especially lucrative for the food industries. After all, the entire purpose of companies is to make money. That's literally their one goal. And they made money hand over fist thanks to the government's Eat More directive. Fast forward a few decades though, and we were still telling people to eat more up through the 1950s and 60s. And thanks to the food rationing during World War II and the associated guidelines that emphasized eating diets rich in fats, people were actually starting to eat too much, or at least too much of the wrong stuff, and starting to suffer the consequences. The US now had a problem on their hands. Eat More had been a win-win-win. Everyone benefited. But now, people were eating too much, and nutrition scientists had the daunting task of convincing the government to change their federal health guideline messaging from eat more to eat less. This was harder said than done. See, when the government was pushing their eat more message, the agriculture industry loved it. And because the eat more message was such an important one, the federal government loved it too. It was a match made in heaven. The food industry and the federal government got in bed together. They worked extremely closely, creating ties between Congress, the lawmaking body, and the food industry that are still around today. So when the messaging changed to eat less, the food industry felt betrayed. How could the government stab them in the back like that? Didn't they know how eat less would hurt their businesses? There were riots. Well, not really riots, but there was a lot of whining and complaining on the part of the food industry. They were upset and needed to get the politicians back on their side. They needed to keep making money. To do this, food companies enlisted the help of PACs and lobbyists. Now, I'm not going to get into the details here, but basically, PACs, or political action committees, are organizations whose sole purpose is to be able to legally donate tons of money to politicians, and lobbyists are people who attempt to influence government policy or action by promoting the views of special interest groups and attempting to influence government laws, rules, or policies that might affect those groups. Food lobbyists, therefore, are people who ask government officials to make rules or laws that will benefit their clients' companies, whether or not they benefit anyone else. Essentially, lobbyists are the people who wine and dine politicians and know their favorite kind of cigar and give them presents for all their kids' birthdays. They are shady creeps who have an unprecedented amount of control over the decisions our representatives make. Anyway, the food companies had these PACs and lobbyists whose job it was to persuade government officials to ignore the eat less advice and continue promoting eat more. Remember, food companies want to make money, so even if it isn't necessarily in the public interest to eat more, the food companies need people to eat more so they can keep making money. Now, even though the scientists were pretty much in consensus that people needed to stop eating more, it's not like the politicians were all gung-ho about the new messaging either. In fact, many of them were downright hostile towards it. Why, you might ask? I mean, if all these scientists had determined what the public needed to be healthy, why wouldn't the government, the body representing the public, want to listen? Why would they fight this? Well, for the exact same reason the food companies were fighting it. See, lobbyists and government officials are not always distinct populations. There are many politicians who used to work in food industries and then moved to politics, and there are many food industry execs who used to be politicians. Today's public servant is tomorrow's lobbyist, and vice versa. The revolving door transformation of government officials into lobbyists and lobbyists into governmental officials is not a new phenomenon either. For example, the chief USDA negotiator who arranged for private companies to sell grain to the Soviet Union in 1972 then resigned to work for the very company that gained the most from that transaction. In other words, many politicians didn't want to listen to the scientists because they had a stake, literally they were stakeholders, in the Eat More guidelines that helped their business ties prosper. Anyway, we had these food industry PACs donating money to politicians, lobbyists whining and dining politicians, politicians with direct ties to the food industry, all of whom were focused on profit, and a body of scientists and the public who just wanted all of us to be healthy, even though that meant we had to eat less. We had all of these groups intertwining and fighting and arguing, and after a series of hearings to discuss the future of federal health guidelines, we had a winner.
The main reason I keep coming back to shop with Misfits Market is for these pretzel pieces.
In the process of coating pretzels in chocolate, a portion of them get broken, and we happen to think these broken pieces are even better than the original. Not only do they have a better chocolate to pretzel ratio, they're also perfect over ice cream. That's just one way
We had a winner. Unsurprisingly, the money won. The politicians caved to industry pressure. It wasn't a total win on the part of the food industry, though. Industry people realized they couldn't continue to just ignore all the scientific evidence. It was pretty clear that the science supported advice to eat less meat and less dairy and just less in general. So, in the face of this indisputable science, what could the industry do? They could bullshit. The compromise between money and health was vague language. They couldn't just ignore the scientific advice, but what they could do was make the language of that advice ambiguous and confusing. They could make the wording weak and wishy-washy. With the influence of their PACs and lobbyists, the food industry folks convinced politicians to change the wording of their health guidelines. They legally had to suggest the idea of eating less, but they didn't want to outright say that people should eat less. So what they did was change eat less of the bad thing to the kinder, if less accurate, eat more of the least bad type of that bad thing. Instead of saying you should eat less meat, they suggested you choose lean meats. When they had to make eat less statements, they covered them in euphemism and technical terms and vagary. Instead of saying you should eat less dairy or eat less salt, they suggested you limit saturated fat intake or reduce sodium consumption. One thing to notice about this wording is that choose is a positive word, and it's associated with a food, meat, whereas limit is a negative word, and it's associated with nutrients, saturated fat, sodium. This is very much a conscious choice. The Eat More guidelines are the only ones that refer to foods, grains, vegetables, fruits. The Eat Less guidelines, in contrast, talk about nutrients or food chemicals, fat, cholesterol, sugar, salt, alcohol, not their food source. They refer to fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol, but not to the most important food sources of fats, meats, dairy, eggs, and fried and processed foods. They refer to salt and sugar, not to pretzels or soft drinks. The language was the loophole. If they could separate the eat less wording from the actual foods, they could trick people into thinking that their foods didn't apply. We can even see an example of this in the transcript of one of the health guideline hearings, where Senator Bob Dole compromised with the president of the National Cattlemen's Association on the wording of the recommendation to decrease consumption of meat. I wonder if you could amend it and say increase consumption of lean meat. Would that taste better to you? Dole asked. Mr. Finney replied, "Decrease is a bad word, Senator. Don't eat less meat. Eat more lean meat." Now, obviously this wasn't an outright win for science, but scientists knew that this was the best they were gonna get, at least for now. So the scientists were placated, the industry folks were happy, and the politicians were happy because the industry folks were happy and would continue to fund their campaigns. What this conflict illuminated, though, was that nutrition science wasn't going away anytime soon. And the industry folks recognized this, and they had to figure out what to do about it. Sooner or later, they were going to have to reckon with the indisputable scientific facts that their foods were maybe not good for people. Enter the age of co-opting science.
Avoid making these 3 mistakes that could be causing a dry, itchy scalp. 1. Sulfates wash away natural oils, which can dry out.
Co-opting science. The food industry realized that if they couldn't just ignore nutrition scientists, they could at least use them. And use them they did. Companies and trade associations hired scientists, funded research, wrote grants, and donated to universities, all in the name of science. Do some experiments to see if our product reduces the heart disease, will you? Test this new strain of fruit we want to grow and tell us how nutritious it is. Now, scientists are not usually very well funded, so they're always looking for people who will pay for their work. They often rely on these kinds of corporate sponsorships and industry grants. Also, being funded by a company to do research on that company's products is not inherently ethically problematic. However, food industry folks weren't doing this out of the kindness of their hearts or out of a genuine objective interest in nutrition science. Co-opting experts is an explicit corporate strategy. A guide to such strategies explains that this particular tactic is most effectively done by identifying the leading experts and giving them research grants and the like. This activity requires a modicum of finesse. It must not be too blatant, for the experts themselves must not recognize that they have lost their objectivity and freedom of action. Companies literally admit to only hiring scientists so they can use the results to market their products. This isn't to say that scientists knowingly, consciously skew their research in favor of the people funding them. This does happen, but it more often happens unconsciously. Unconscious bias is a thing, and it happens to scientists just like the rest of us. Even if it's uncommon, it is a thing that happens, and it's something we need to be aware of. What is more common, though, is that scientists will do good objective science and come out with results that are lukewarm at best. Like, our results indicate there may be a link between eating X brand almonds and a lower likelihood of getting heart disease, but more testing is required to determine the exact nature of this link. Then, the company that hired them will twist those results and use them in their marketing. X brand almonds, definitely a heart-healthy snack. Between the ambiguous language of health guidelines and the confusing and skewed research, nutrition has become a complicated subject. Food industry folks know this. They know it can be hard to tell what exactly is a healthy or unhealthy food. After all, even potato chips are made out of vegetables and have vitamins and minerals. And they take advantage of this. If people are confused about nutrition, they will be more likely to accept such claims at face value. It is in the interest of food companies to have people believe that there is no such thing as a good food except when it's theirs, that there's no such thing as a bad food, especially not theirs, and that all foods, especially theirs, can be incorporated into healthful diets, and that no advice to restrict intake of their particular product is appropriate. This is the reason why it seems like there's a new scientific study touting the positive health effects of some new superfood every couple months. Because there is. Because companies keep paying scientists to do more and more research and flood the market. It's confusing because it is designed to be. When we are overwhelmed with information, when scientists lose their credibility for seemingly contradicting themselves so often, when we don't know who to trust or what to believe, we can more easily be taken advantage of. And this is where we're at today. Now, there have been way more big disputes between scientists, the government, and food companies that I have not talked about. If you want to check those out, I highly recommend reading the main book that I'm using for this episode, Food Politics: How the Food Industry Influences Nutrition and Health by Marion Nestle. She's a food scientist who actually worked as an advisor for the federal government when they were making and revising these health guidelines, so she has seen firsthand the corruption in the system. Anyway, generally speaking, this is how we got here, and this is where we are right now. Health experts say that we need to eat less, but companies want us to eat more so they can keep selling their products. Scientists and politicians are in the pocket of food industries so that the industries can ensure the federal health guidelines don't stray too far in the eat less direction. And we, the actual people who live and shop and eat in this country, are left with a confusing mess. And regardless of how well we try to eat and how smart we try to be about our food choices, obesity and disease rates are still rising. Something is wrong.
With Ashley's next-gen Nuvella Performance fabric, you can relax.
Something is wrong. So, what is actually at the root of this problem? We have this tangled web of relationships and money and influence, but what is their cause? What is the string that, if pulled, will unravel this whole mess? Capitalism. Now, before you go angry typing your hate comments about how I'm some un-American commie, let me explain. At the beginning, I mentioned that companies' one goal is to make money. They produce things, they influence our health and well-being, but at the end of the day, their goal is to make money. This doesn't mean that food companies will just feed us sawdust and garbage. They do care about nutrition, as long as it has a positive effect on their sales. Food companies are not health or social service agencies, and nutrition becomes a factor in corporate thinking only when it can help sell food. If you want an example of this, just look at how many different kinds of supposedly healthy products there are on the shelves. Do we want cookies with no sugar added, or the ones made with real sugar? Or the organic ones? Or the ones that have been fortified with 8 different vitamins and minerals? Or the ones that say they're a good source of fiber? Food companies know that all of these messages sound good, and that we usually accept those claims at face value. But if we actually looked at the nutritional value of those products, we'd realize that a lot of those supposedly healthy foods are actually full of crap. More than 1/4 of new products created in a year are nutritionally enhanced, so they can be marketed as low in fat, cholesterol, salt, or sugar, or as higher in fiber, calcium, or vitamins. Some such products, among them no-fat cookies, vitamin-enriched cereals, and calcium-fortified juice drinks, contain so much sugar that they belong at the top of the food pyramid. Developing such foods has only one purpose: to attract sales. Now, you might argue that the solution for this is for people to just read food labels more carefully, but A, most health claims are harder to dispute than that, and B, the only reason that we even have food labels in the first place is because doctors and scientists and the public fought for them. Companies make and market and sell products only to make money. They do not care about your health. They care about making money. If they can do that by making you think that their foods are healthy, then they will do that. But they have no obligation to make their foods as healthy as their claims suggest they are. They have no obligation to make ethical decisions if they're not legally required to. They will only make ethical decisions as long as it makes them money. Companies are in business to make money. That is their job. For stockholders, it is irresponsible and illegal for companies to make decisions that will not lead to increased profits. If companies offer foods of minimal nutritional value and people buy them, companies will continue to make and market them. If fat, sugar, and salt help to sell products, company will market top of the pyramid products. If nutrition, added vitamins, reduced fat, helps to sell products, companies will use nutrition as a marketing tool, whether or not the products are actually healthy. Clearly, there is a discrepancy between the goals of companies and the goals of people who care about our health. And that is literally killing us. So what do we do about this? How do we solve this problem? Well, outside of just tearing down the system and starting from scratch, one go-to answer is to just tax the hell out of the problematic industries or to otherwise make it monetarily unfavorable to stay in business. However, it's not like meat and dairy industries are just independent entities that are just like evil supervillain layers that you can just destroy without any repercussions and then get a gold medal from the president calling you a hero. No, these businesses are all interconnected. And even worse, they're all good for our economy. Think about how many people are employed to work in these industries. Just getting rid of them, even if it would be the best for our health, isn't a feasible choice. We can't make these kinds of big changes because it affects everything. Ethical or not, a message to eat less meat, dairy, and processed foods is not going to be popular among the producers of such foods. The message will not be popular with cattle ranchers, meat packers, dairy producers, or milk bottlers, oilseed growers, processors, or transporters, grain producers, makers of soft drinks, candy bars, and snack foods, owners of fast food outlets and franchise restaurants, media corporations and advertising agencies, manufacturers and marketers of television sets and computers where the advertising takes place. The range of economic sectors that would be affected if people change their diets is immense. The shadowy cabal of industry and government officials who are pulling the strings on our health are all aware of this. They know that our economy is a delicate, tangled mess. It's a complex system, a living organism. So if any one industry dies, it can and will have a ripple effect of consequences. The powers that be want to keep our system intact, even though it is killing people. USDA officials believe that really encouraging people to follow dietary guidelines would be so expensive and disruptive to the agricultural economy as to create impossible political barriers. In other words, the government, their scientists, and the corporations that fund the whole operation are working together to lie to the American public at the cost of our health and our lives because changing things would be too expensive and disruptive. That's a conspiracy if I've ever heard one, folks. So, changing things, fundamentally, isn't going to work. So, what do these powerful groups suggest we do in the meantime? Well, they propose a more politically expedient solution. The industry should work to improve the food supply through nutrient fortification and the development of functional foods with added nutritional value. Such proposals raise ethical dilemmas of their own, though. These foods are not necessarily healthier, and they still encourage people to eat more, not less. They want to go with a cautious middle ground approach. Except that isn't actually better for us. So clearly that's not a sustainable solution. Great. Now, it's not all doom and gloom. There are some solutions that can work. For one, a lot of nutrition journals are making scientists be more upfront about who is funding their research. This way, data is more transparent and can be scrutinized for bias way more easily. As for us little people, we can elect politicians who support lobbying reform. We can elect politicians who don't have ties to the food industry. We can also vote with our wallets, or with our forks, as Marion Nestle phrases it. When possible, buy whole, processed, mostly plant-based foods. The foods that are good for us, and that scientists have known are good for us forever, really. Foods that aren't argued about because the science is settled. They're healthy. Now, I know this isn't possible for everyone. I mean, hell, my last video was about white trash food and why poor folks don't eat healthy foods. Link in the description for that. But this is a good step if you can take it. But it is not a universal solution. Okay, so what about education? Can we just teach everyone about all the stuff the food industry is doing to take advantage of them and how to make healthier choices with their eating? Well, we do kind of do that already. Everything we've done educationally is pretty milquetoast, though. We had the food pyramid and My Plate and Michelle Obama's healthy eating initiatives, and we're still having problems. Part of this is because while education is important, it doesn't do a great job of fundamentally changing systems. Educational approaches are relatively uncontroversial because they're phrased in euphemisms, can be easily countered by advertising, and have little impact on food choice. Changing the food environment is another matter. Okay, so how do we change the food environment? I don't know. Outside of tearing it all down and starting over, I don't know. I don't know what the solution is. I don't know how to make companies care more about people than about money. I don't know how to keep money out of politics. I don't know how to help people be healthy when healthy is almost meaningless at this point, and when income inequality and food deserts mean that a substantial number of people just can't eat healthy with the way our system is currently set up. I don't know how to change the fact that we have industries that are too big to fail but too dangerous to keep around. Voting, with our ballots and with our forks, can change things, but I don't know how much it can change the fundamental principles underlying this whole mess. I wish there were some answer I could give, but I don't have one. Maybe listen to scientists, listen to experts, listen to people who don't have any monetary ties to industry. Remove the money, and you remove the problem. I mean, just think about how healthy we could be if we pruned away all the industry-diseased branches, if we removed our system from the equation and, for once, didn't make our decisions based on what's best for corporations. What if our government actually was of the people, by the people, and for the people? Until that happens, do your best to stay safe out there.
For the ones who get it done, the most important